watched, I think, raises quite a few concrete ideas for transforming the food system. And many of those involve civil society and government working more closely together. So in this panel, we've invited some speakers whose work kind of directly addresses a few of those potential solutions. And they're working in sustainable food procurement, in food policy councils, as well as in government directly. So we have with us Leah Galvin, a freelancer and Churchill Fellow with a background in public health, nutrition, community and regional development and sustainable food systems. We also have Kylie Newberry, a writer, speaker, advocate and founder of Our Food System and Urban Edible. And we also have Amy McMahon, the MP for South Brisbane, who holds the Green State portfolios for health, education, housing and disability services. Thanks everyone for joining us today. So I might sort of go through and chat with all our panelists kind of one by one. So I might start with you, Leah. You've got some expertise on sustainable food procurement. So could you tell us what is sustainable food procurement? How does it work? And what are some of the opportunities and barriers for actually implementing this in Australia?
Thanks, Joanna. It's great to join you. I'd like to acknowledge the Malakati people from southeast Lutruwita, Tasmania. That's where I'm joining you from today. Expertise, I have some. I would say I'm skimming across the top, though, to be honest. I did a Churchill Fellowship earlier this year, and I was looking at models that business and government are using to undertake sustainable institutional food procurement. So let's take a little step back. I'll give you a little 101 first. So when I'm talking about institutions, I'm talking about hospitals, aged care, long day care, schools, prisons, Meals on Wheels and universities, for example. And the great thing about institutions is that the amount of food that they need is highly predictable. So it's interesting for business. And I like thinking about institutional food procurement because I think it allows us to disrupt the food system at scale. So what institutions can do when they start thinking about their procurement sustainably is they can choose who they buy from, they can choose what they buy, and they can also make choices about how food is produced. So my guiding principle in thinking about sustainable institutional food procurement is that when governments are spending public money, our money, it should be about creating public good. So I'll give you just a couple of examples of the kinds of goals or objectives you could achieve in sustainable institutional food procurement through contracts that institutions have with their suppliers. So, for example, institutions could require that food is more climate friendly. So that could include things like specifying that you want there to be shorter supply chains, that you want food to be produced with a reduced inputs. It could be about less meat, better meat, more plants. It could be also around objectives around increasing the diversity of suppliers, for example, having systems that allow small and medium enterprises to navigate the procurement system, and that could include things like food hubs and urban food growers. It could also be about improving the quality and freshness of food, increasing our self-reliance through local sourcing and regional sourcing, focusing on things like improving the livelihoods of people that work in the food system, improving animal welfare, and it could also have an overarching objective around improving our local economies so that there are more jobs. So when I went on my Churchill Fellowship in May and June this year, what I found in the 7 countries that I visited is that sustainable institutional food procurement is increasingly common. I literally could have visited hundreds of people. This is how normal it is. What it does is it levers change in the food system at scale and embeds important community values through the procurement of institutions. One of the big opportunities is that it encourages collaboration across the food system. So we're going to hear today about food policy councils, achieving the sustainable development goals, and communities influencing our political leaders. And in fact, all of those things were elements of successful institutional food procurement that I saw. So it's great that we're talking about this today. The big opportunity for us here in Australia is we're not really doing it at the moment. There might be some of it going on, but it's really tinkering. we know it works. We can learn so much from the overseas experience. And what I saw was that, that you can achieve social, health, economic and environmental outcomes. I think one of the great ways for us to start would be around mapping the size of the opportunity in Australia and at a state level, because most of these institutions are led by states. At the moment, the reason probably why that's not happening is because our policy settings are not strong. But in saying that, don't go looking for a local food institutional food procurement policy. You don't need that. Things like a social procurement policy or even objectives around improving environmental outcomes from agriculture are all possible levers for starting the conversation about sustainable food procurement. What we really need right now, and this is our barrier probably, is leadership. And then we also need the investment, because this doesn't just magically happen, even if you do have a strong policy setting. I visited with lots of people who are facilitators, actors and researchers who are pulling all of this together, bringing the right people together so that the change can be made at an institutional level. So I think this complements quite nicely the sort of overarching objectives you have through your project here. I'm pleased to introduce everybody to this concept around sustainable institutional food procurement today. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks so much. No, that's great. And I really liked everything that you said, but particularly the point that, this is a transformative mechanism that actually works at scale, because I think that's, increasingly important when we talk about the food system. We have to consider the scale thereof. And you mentioned how policy settings are kind of particularly important here. So I think that leads quite nicely onto our next speaker, Kylie Newberry. So Kylie, I'm keen to hear from you about food policy councils. Can you tell us what they are and what are some of the opportunities or the challenges when it comes to growing food policy councils in Australia?
Hi, thanks for inviting me to talk. I firstly would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which I am coming to you from today, which is the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So I'm going to be talking about food policy councils, and I actually came across the model over 10 years ago now when I studied my master's, and I was really fascinated by the power of a food policy council, so much so that I did my dissertation on it. So I've been it's been on my mind for a long time. So a food policy council is a coming together of stakeholders and actors from different sectors within the food system to provide a means to creating a joined up approach to food policy. And I'm sharing slides because I'm a visual person and I like to, so that's a way in which I like to share content. But basically, like why create a food policy council? And Mark Winnie, who is a food activist in the States, he's been working in this food movement space for over 50 years and was a real sort of forerunner in creating a food policy council. He identified, they basically said, food experts and activists realized that a vast food system generated many policies, and for the most part, the average citizen didn't have much of a say in shaping them. So one way to address this lack of participation was by creating food policy councils to bring together all stakeholders in a community food system to have a say in constructing a system that reflected their values. So every 2 years, the Johns Hopkins Centre for a Livable Future, which is located in the States, gather data from all of the food policy councils that are established there, and there's close to 300 in America and Canada, and they survey the food policy councils. And basically, the thing with the food policy council is that it has diverse membership. I'm not going to go through all of the members here, but you can see that it's widely represented by community members. That's a really big part, and that's because the purpose is to give community members a say, like to hear what it is that they want. Public health are represented, anti-hunger, food production, healthcare, labour, food retail, social justice, economic development, food waste. You can see that it's really representing all sectors of the food system, but also many of the key issues and challenges that we experience as well. whether that's health or environmental or social issues. So every food system looks unique. Like there's no one sort of standard food policy council, and what you'll find is that where they're located also varies. So a third can be housed within a non-profit, a quarter are embedded in local government or state government, potentially. It could be a grassroots coalition or located in a non-profit or embedded in university. They can also be at the local level, they can be at the regional level, and some are even at the state level. The thing that's unique to this Food Policy Council structure that I see in the States is that members are actually elected, like they're selected based on their networks within the community or within the food system, and they're elected on as a member of the Food Policy Council. So some of the challenges, I don't actually have this one written here, but I think one of the big challenges is most people don't actually know what a Food Policy Council is. You know, it's really common in the States, but in Australia, we've certainly had alliances and advocacy groups come together to try to influence policy. In fact, many of us on the call today were members of the Brisbane Fair Food Alliance, which were doing that. But and many have existed around Australia. But in terms of the Food Policy Council, we don't really have a model here in Australia that fits that. Organisational structure is challenging. As you all know, food sits across many policy areas. It doesn't sit neatly into one area, so it can be challenging to identify key people to, when we're talking about food, organisational challenging, structure is challenging. Political priorities, as Brianna alluded to, you know, this top-down approach, food is often not recognised as one of the areas in which we can actually make a significant difference. Finding a champion is also often one of the big drivers that creates change. And in many of the local governments down in Victoria that have created food system strategies, there's been this champion, which is often the mayor, that's pushed forward things. And funding, you know, we really do need funding to be available to food policy councils. Usually a coordinator is employed who then, you know, can keep progressing things. And the models that have existed here in Australia have often just been run by volunteers, which leads to volunteer burnout. And Leah alluded to this before, like we really need leadership and we need investment. So opportunities, you know, like food insecurity is you know, increasing consistently over the past few years, from COVID, now from rising food prices. We're seeing constant disruptions to the local food supply due to extreme weather events. You know, the economic changes are, you know, a real issue for people when it comes to the rising cost of food. And a number of local governments are really recognising their role in addressing many of these challenges. So, you know, I feel like there's an opportunity to position a Food Policy Council as one model to create change. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kylie. That was a really great, brief but comprehensive overview of food policy councils. So our last panellist is Amy McMahon, the MP for South Brisbane. So I want to ask Amy, I guess we've heard from Leah and Kylie kind of on the civil society side of things, but Amy is someone, you know, you're currently in Parliament and working in state politics. So I'd like to ask you kind of, where do you see the biggest opportunities for civil society or fair food networks to get more involved with shaping government policy making around food?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. And a big thanks to Leah and Kylie for a really good overview of what's happening in like governance spaces, political spaces and civil society spaces as well. And thank you to the organisers for today. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm meeting from the land of the Yagara and Turrbal people, where sovereignty has never been ceded. So I wanted to pick up on some of the points that have already been raised around the kinds of challenges that people are facing at the moment and what opportunities there are in there to be pushing for some of these fair food futures that you've outlined so well this morning with the animation and the discussion so far. We are facing a real a crunch point, an economic and political crisis at the moment. We've got inflation that is growing, a lot of people in housing stress, people struggling to pay rent, people struggling to pay their mortgage, rising cost of transport, people affording fuel or even getting access to public transport. As has been mentioned, natural disasters that have had an impact on cost of living, which is having an impact on people's day-to-day food security. And this is definitely what we have been seeing on the ground here in South Brisbane, but definitely right across the state. The food charities working around here are under increasing pressure and seeing new demographics of people coming into contact with these services that they haven't seen before. The links between the housing crisis and the food security crisis, I think, are very close, because food, as we know, is one of the most flexible elements of a household budget. And if you are paying more and more for your rent, or you're paying more and more for your mortgage, it's something like food that is going to be the more flexible element there. And the impacts that is having on people's health and well-being, their nutritional intake as well. And this is set against this broader political crisis that we're seeing at the moment, where a lot of these big challenges over the decades have been left to the private market to deal with. So housing has been largely left to the private market, resulting in the kind of crisis that we've got at the moment. Healthcare, increasing pressure in our hospitals, with both the primary healthcare space leading into very constrained hospitals. Education, being able to get access to free primary education, tertiary education, a lot of economic pressures on people. In the clean energy space, also this has been largely left to the private sector to deal with. And I think there's these kinds of threads coming together with this broader crisis that we're living in at the moment. And this is definitely playing out in the food space, where we see there's immense corporate capture of our food systems that governments have facilitated and bought into in a lot of ways. We know that corporate interests have a disproportionate impact on decision making that goes on at all levels of governments. And this is particularly true in the food space, where we see these few large actors that get huge amounts of support. They get government subsidies, they get assistance with planning approvals. Woolworths and Coles obviously have a real capture. And it means that for the vast majority of people, that's where they're getting their food. And if you can't afford to go there, you can be in a very difficult situation. I wanted to give one example of how this kind of corporate approach to food is linking into other aspects of the political system. There's a community housing provider that works locally that do really amazing work building community housing, providing community housing. They're about to start a partnership with Woolworths. So where Woolworths are building new supermarkets, they're going to integrate housing above that. And in a lot of ways, this is great because it means people are co-located with services. They're in an area that will have lots of people coming and going. It'll be kind of vibrant new developments. But at the same time, you can see how this is really locking in that corporate food system. And for people who are particularly vulnerable, people who are trying to get into social housing, kind of locking them into Coles, so Woolworths rather, as the place where they get food. And then if they're unable to go down to the supermarket that's right below their apartment and afford that food, what other options are available to them? And urban planning more broadly really geared towards these big corporate food providers, as opposed to creating space for community gardens or new developments that are co-located with smaller food retailers or community food retailers. A broader urban design that's really focused on car-centric planning, as opposed to investing in active and public transport. That means people can access different food outlets, get to the markets, or or go to local stores easily to be able to get their food. So fitting it into this broader, this kind of broader picture of this kind of corporate capture in politics, I think one of the key spaces for a lot of these civil society movements and food movements is to be finding ways to be pushing for food justice in a way that acknowledges this broader system and is able to link in solidarity with other movements that are going on, and having a very clear picture that what we're pushing back against is a corporate food network that has let us down economically, socially, and environmentally as well. And I take a lot of inspiration from looking at those movements in different sectors and in different parts of the world that have been successful are often those that are building up these big networks on the ground, these big networks of civil society, these big community movements that are working in partnership, but somewhat autonomously from political representatives, and have an understanding of power that is trying to refocus power and decision-making back to the grassroots. There's a great bit of research that I often revisit around what are those factors that have led to countries having policies around women's rights, for example. And one of the key factors, more so than the wealth of a country or having women in positions of power, one of the key factors was having these autonomous feminist movements that had a concept of power, were drawing in these networks of solidarity, and were then able to have a movement strong enough and big enough to be pushing elected representatives to be making these kinds of changes. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in civil society and food movements to be looking at similar models and having a very clear kind of political outlook on this. These things aren't just neutral networks, and food is inherently political. And there's some really exciting examples, I think, that are going on locally that are making some ground, that are able to link food with broader struggles as well. One of the examples is the occupation that's going on out at Deebing Creek, where there's a First Nations community that have held some very large developers at bay for over 3 years now, and they have combined their reoccupation of the land with a food security movement, and are looking at ways that they can be providing nutritional food to people, recreating Indigenous food systems, and at the same time they're pushing back against these big developers that are really just out there for profit to make a huge urban sprawl. Locally, we've got some networks of community gardens that have similarly been working to reoccupy land that might otherwise be developed. The Growing Forward Network have done an amazing job setting up community gardens where they're providing food freely to local organisations that are providing food to vulnerable communities or refugee communities, and they're occupying pockets of land that are under threat from development. One example down at Kangaroo Point, where the proposed Gabba development might take over a local park. There's a little community garden there that is part of the resistance in pushing back against that redevelopment and making sure that the community has access to these open spaces. And I think finding ways to embed these food movements into other movements will be really powerful. Finding those networks of solidarity in the housing movement, for example, the broader push that's going on at the moment for more social housing, bringing that in collaboration with pushing for making sure you've got these places that are beautifully designed, that have access to green space, that have places for people to grow food, that are co-located with, rather than a Woolworths, maybe you've got some kind of local food outlets you can be working with. Pushing for urban design that prioritises open space and places to grow food and places for people to connect as well. Pushing for things like school breakfasts and lunches at schools. We've had a little bit of success at the state government level. They've expanded their school lunch program, but this is something we could be doing in every school right across the state, thinking of schools as kinds of hubs of wellbeing, where every child can come there and they know they'll be able to get a nutritional meal, and perhaps that food is coming from a local garden as well. looking at ways that communities can be working together to address the kind of acute food security needs of people as well. I mentioned that food charity is very stretched at the moment, but finding ways to embed in that and be talking about broader discussions around the cost of housing, cost of transport, the cost of welfare payments, for example, making sure you've got that kind of holistic discussion there, and then working in solidarity with these various different movements. And I think that's a really powerful approach that I think a lot of these food networks are already taking. They have an understanding of power, they have an understanding of what we're pushing back against, and having this kind of vision that we're building towards. I think one of the other opportunities here in Queensland is how we might leverage the Human Rights Act, which doesn't mention food directly, but does talk about protection of families and children, and how can we be drawing that into discussions around urban planning, housing developments, to be saying, is this focused on the food security of families and children? And I think there's some exciting kind of niches going on in Queensland at the moment, particularly in the housing space, to try and make sure we're linking these two things together and understanding that housing is having a direct impact on people's food insecurity, and how we might be able to address those two things together. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. You were saying about the interconnections of all these issues really speaks to not only our findings of the scenarios, but also the sort of things we'll be discussing in the podcast.